even though there's been a long time of attenuation between classical Marxism on the one hand and critical race theory and various other aspects of critical theory that are like it, it's been a long time, a significant attenuation. Nevertheless, there is still, in what we see today, some of what was there at the beginning. And to the extent that what was there at the beginning is itself theoretically flawed, those flaws have been carried forward in what we see today. And I hope to demonstrate what some of those flaws are as we go forward. What I'd like to do in this session is to try to explain to you exactly what critical race theory is, both so that you'll just understand it, but also so that you'll be able to recognize it whenever you come across it. Now, I have to warn you in advance, as Mr. McNeely said, that this is the deepest dive we're going to take in the whole series, and for that reason, this will be the longest session. But I ask you to bear with me because I think it's very important that you understand before we start talking about the problems that critical race theory can create, that you really have an idea, a clear idea of what it is. In later sessions, we're going to talk about the threats that critical race theory poses to the society at large, but more particularly, because this is our concern in this series, the risks that it poses to evangelicalism. And unless you have a clear idea of what critical race theory is going in, a lot of the warnings that we want to share with you, the dangers that we want to share to you, will not be that understandable. All right, so again, I ask you to fasten your seatbelts and put on your thinking caps and stay with me. So what is critical race theory? Well, the first thing that should be said is that it is a branch or a division of a larger theory that goes by the name of critical theory, simply. Critical race theory is the branch of critical theory that focuses on supposed causes of, and then supposed remedies for the particular problem of racial oppression, as opposed to other forms of oppression, such as gender, sexual oppression, etc. So to understand what critical race theory is, you first of all have to understand what critical theory in general is. And that's a pretty tall order, because in fact, critical theory it's fairly old now, 70, 80 years, depending on how you reckon its beginning. And during the course of that time, it has naturally enough evolved. Let me read to you a definition from the Encyclopedia Britannica of critical theory in its early stages. Critical theory, a Marxist-inspired movement in social and political philosophy originally associated with the work of the Frankfurt School, drawing particularly on the thought of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud, critical theorists maintain that a primary goal of philosophy is to understand and to help overcome the social structures through which people are dominated and oppressed. Well, that's a pretty good definition of what critical theory was at the beginning, but as I said before, it's evolved a bit. Do we have a definition of it in its more evolved form? Well, actually, we do. Compliments of a fellow named Neil Shenvi, who, though a chemist by trade, nevertheless is something of an authority on critical theory. Here's his definition of critical theory in its modern form. Critical theory is an ideology which divides the world into dominant oppressor groups and subordinate oppressed groups along lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, physical ability, and a host of other factors. It sees oppressed groups as being subordinated to oppressor groups by something that it calls hegemonic power, which is the ability of the dominant group to impose its values on the culture. The dominant group decides what's valuable, what's good, what's normal, and sort of brainwashes all of society into thinking that this is true, including the oppressed people. So that the mission is to enable the oppressed people to be liberated from that hegemonic power. And for that, they have to be shown, first of all, that it is in fact a lie, a ruse, that the values that are a part of this hegemonic power of the dominant group are not universal, absolute values, but they are the norms that are instituted by the powerful ruling group. Notice in this definition, this notion of a division, which is essential to this theory of society itself into opposing identity groups of various kinds. And in each set of social groups, social identity groups, what you have is one, or maybe more in some cases, but one oppressing the other, and doing so by means of ideology, by means of what are referred to as social structures. We're going to have to explain a little bit more about what that means later on, that convince the oppressed folks, as well as everybody else, that the system that now exists, even though it disadvantages them in some way and privileges the other identity group, the one that is the oppressor group, nevertheless is exactly as it ought to be, is entirely normal, and thereby helps to maintain the status quo. Now, I think if you really want to understand what critical race theory is all about, you're going to have to look at its history. And the history of critical race theory, if you go all the way back to the beginning, is tied to Marxism. In fact, critical theory itself, of which critical race theory is a part, is sometimes referred to colloquially as cultural Marxism. Now, my experience has been that everybody who is an adherent of critical race theory takes this as an insult, as something of a pejorative expression. And they accuse those who use it against them of trying to get some mileage out of the fact that Marxism is, generally speaking, among most people, certainly in the evangelical context, a dirty word, right? It may be that there are some people who use this expression, cultural Marxism, as a pejorative for that purpose, but I'm not one of them. For me, given my background, Marxism is not a dirty word. So when I use it, I'm simply being descriptive. And I think it's important to use it occasionally because, as we're going to see, even though there's been a long time of attenuation between classical Marxism on the one hand and critical race theory and various other aspects of critical theory that are like it, it's been a long time, a significant attenuation. Nevertheless, there is still, in what we see today, some of what was there at the beginning. And to the extent that what was there at the beginning is itself theoretically flawed, those flaws have been carried forward in what we see today. And I hope to demonstrate what some of those flaws are as we go forward. Okay, the beginning of the history is with what I'd call classical Marxism. That is the work of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. I don't want to get bogged down in a lot of detail here, but I do want to mention a couple of things. Marxist theory was that history moves through various phases. Yes, the feudal phase right before the capitalist phase. And that what determines each of these new phases, what brings it about, is some change in what he called the economic base. See, he claimed that at every particular point in the course of history, there was a particular economic base, which means the way in which the means of production were arranged, who controlled them, who were controlled by them. And this base, in turn, he said, created a complementary superstructure. Meaning what? Well, that's a technical reference to all of the social, the political institutions that are associated with that particular economic base. Think about it. Government at the time of feudalism was rather different from government during the capitalist period. Marx would say the reason that the government is different is that the government is, as part of the superstructure, is responding to and being determined by the base. And so for Marx, if you wanted to change to the next, or wanted to move to the next phase of history, whatever that may be, you didn't change the superstructure. That would take care of itself. What you did was you changed the economic base. And he thought at the time that he wrote that Western civilization, at least, was on the cusp of a move to the final phase in history, that of the workers' paradise, socialism, communism, as it might have been called, depending upon the work of his that you're considering. And the way that this would happen, he suggested, was, again, to change the base, specifically for the workers, the proletariat, to rise up and take control of the means of production. Okay, let's move forward in time a bit. After the Russian Revolution, 1917, we have in Russia and in a few places near Russia the beginning of seemingly what Marx had predicted. But it wasn't happening anywhere else. There were no workers' revolutions taking place elsewhere. There were some attempts, but they all failed. And so folks who considered themselves to be Marxists faced something of a puzzle. And that is, why in the world is it that the worldwide workers' revolution that Marx's theory clearly predicted has not yet happened? And so they began to search for explanations. Some of the earliest folks to look at this problem were named Georgy Lukács, and even more importantly, Antonio Gramsci. How did they explain how it is that the workers' revolution that had been predicted did not come about? They turned their attention back to the superstructure, that is, to the social and the political institutions. And they focused on them to a degree that Marx did not. Marx, in fact, had ignored them. And what they hypothesized was, in fact, the superstructure itself can be a force, a powerful force for resisting the kinds of changes in the economic base that Marx predicted would happen. In fact, the superstructure, the social institutions, the political institutions, the dominant ideology of the dominant group can have the effect of actually undermining revolutionary fervor, and then here's a critically important term, legitimizing the existing order. Gramsci had a word for this. He called it, or an expression for it. He called it cultural hegemony. Now, hegemony is a big, scary word. No, not really. It's simply that etymology indicates that it comes from a word that means leadership. And the idea is this, that the dominant economic group in the society exerts oppressive force on the weaker groups in society, not only through economic means, but also through the superstructure. The superstructure, the values of the society and the social institutions, they all create the impression, Gramsci said, this is cultural hegemony, that the existing economic order is entirely normal, and indeed suggests that it couldn't be otherwise than it is. Why is it that the means of production are in the hands of just a few capitalists? Well, that's just the way that it's got to be, given the way that we have set up our economic system, our society, our political system. This is entirely natural, and it couldn't be any other way. And what Gramsci claimed is that lots of folks in the oppressed group, indeed most folks even in the oppressed group, not just the oppressors, but the oppressed, would buy in to this dominant ideology, part of the cultural hegemony, to the point that they would not seek to change the underlying economic base and content themselves with their second-class position. Gramsci had a name for this that he had gotten, in fact, from Frederick Engels, false consciousness. That is, the workers have the same view of the world, including the economic system, as do the capitalists. And because they do, they don't recognize what's really going on, which is they're being oppressed. So Gramsci is a pivotal figure here in the development of what eventually comes to be known as neo-Marxism in all of its varieties. Before we leave the subject of Gramsci, I should say one thing about the approach that he developed to trying to pursue the same revolutionary ideas as had Marx. He generally rejected the idea of a straight-up workers' revolution in which the proletarians rise up and violently take control of the means of production. He thought that would probably be a cataclysmic failure. He said instead, at least the first thing we need to do is to fight the hegemonic power. And how do we do that? By seeing to it that people who think as we do, who have the same vision of economic, social, and political reality, get placed into positions of prominence and influence within the existing social and political institutions. So we're talking about in the universities and other schools, in the courts, in the legislature, so that these people in those positions can first of all declare what is going on, at least from our point of view, which is this sort of hidden oppression through ideology, and then also take steps to disrupt, actually is the word that was used, disrupt the existing institutions in such a way as to precipitate a crisis. All right. As we go further down the timeline of historical development of what eventually is going to be critical race theory, the next major development we come to is the foundation of and the flourishing of the so-called Frankfurt School, which you remember I had alluded to in my autobiographical statement in the first session. The Frankfurt School is so called because of the place in Germany where the group of scholars who composed it were first located. Scholars such as Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and of particular importance for understanding what eventually happened in the U.S. with critical theory, Herbert Marcuse. Horkheimer, in fact, is the one who coined the expression critical theory. Now, what is it important to understand about the Frankfurt School? There's a lot that I could say. Again, as I explained in my autobiography, I was once very much a devotee of this particular approach, but I want to keep it to the essentials. The essential thing, I think, for us to understand is that, like Gramsci, they turned their attention away from the economic base to the superstructure. They focused on the problem of cultural hegemony, the way in which social institutions, dominant social values tend to reinforce the existing stratifications of society and continue to produce outcomes more favorable to those who had the means of production, the capitalists, than those who were working for them. And so also, like Gramsci, their prescription was that we need to fight this, fight the hegemony, challenge this ideological superstructure that is having the effect of dampening revolutionary fervor and legitimizing the existing order in such a way as to combat false consciousness and bring about a more revolutionary mindset among the oppressed. Moving forward along the timeline yet again, we come to the development of liberation theology, which is something I also alluded to in my autobiographical statement, because at one point in time I considered myself to be a liberation theologian. Let me read to you from the Encyclopedia Britannica a description of this particular theology. Liberation theology, a religious movement arising in late 20th century Roman Catholicism and centered in Latin America. It sought to apply religious faith by aiding the poor and oppressed through involvement in political and civic affairs. It stressed both heightened awareness of the sinful socioeconomic structures, hear that word again, that cause social inequities and active participation in changing those structures. Liberation theologians believe that God speaks particularly through the poor, and that the Bible can be understood properly only when seen from the perspective of the poor. That last little part of the description is very interesting because what the liberation theologians thought they were engaged in was rethinking theology from a new standpoint. As they saw it, most, if not all, theology that had theretofore been developed in, at least in the West, had been developed from the standpoint of people in power. What the liberation theologians wanted to do was to now think about theology from the perspective of the oppressed, see what their lived experience of reality as it might be informed by theology was. Now, after, on the timeline, liberation theology, comes another development, another one in which I was involved or with which I was connected, as I explained before, called critical legal studies. Critical legal studies. I'm going to read again because I think this is done better than anything I could do spontaneously on my own. This is from that incomparably unquestionable source, Wikipedia, but on this point, I assure you it's accurate. Critical legal studies is a school of critical theory that first emerged as a movement in the United States during the 70s. Its adherents claim that laws are used to maintain the status quo of society's power structures. There's that word again. It is also held that the law is a codified form of society's biases against marginalized groups. Key goals shared by all critical legal studies scholars: to demonstrate the ambiguity and possible preferential outcomes of supposedly impartial and rigid legal doctrines, to publicize historical, social, economic, psychological results of legal decisions, to demystify legal analysis and legal culture in order to impose transparency on legal processes so that they earn the general support of socially responsible citizens. As I indicated in my autobiography, this was all the rage at Harvard whenever I was there as a law student, and it was really just getting off the ground. And there's been a lot of development under the heading of critical legal studies since then. But again, the important thing for us to recognize is that this is yet another variation on the theme of neo-Marxism that focuses upon social and political structures instead of the economic base, and which presupposes that these structures are inherently oppressive, that they are in fact means whereby those who enjoy privileges and advantages maintain those privileges and advantages at the expense of those who are oppressed in one way. And indeed, the critical legal studies scholars were often so radical that they kind of became pessimistic. They looked back over the history of, say, civil rights legislation and civil rights litigation. And what they saw was, yeah, a lot of these developments did benefit the people that they were intended to benefit, but at the same time, they became a part of legitimizing superstructure that inadvertently and contrary to what was intended actually served to keep the very people who were sought to be helped down, to continue the oppression and reinforce it. So the critical legal studies view, as I say, pessimistic, was just about anything we try to do to change the superstructure might in fact be counterproductive because it's simply going to have a reinforcing effect, at least at some secondary level of consequences. Now, we finally arrive at the point on the historical timeline at which we can talk about what we're really interested in, which is critical race theory. Critical race theory was an offshoot of critical legal studies. That is, it started in law schools and spread from there to the rest of the academy. And it started also at Harvard with a professor named Derek Bell. I happened to miss him. He had left for the West Coast right before I got there and didn't return to Harvard until after I'd left, but I certainly heard a lot about him when I was there. Let me read this description of critical race theory to you. You understand we're talking about critical race theory now at its very beginning. Critical race theory is a school of thought meant to emphasize the effects of race on one's social standing. It originated among legal scholars like Derek Bell, who argued that racism and white supremacy were defining elements of the American legal system and of American society writ large, despite language related to equal protection in our laws. Early proponents like Bell argued for a contextual, historicized analysis of the law that would challenge seemingly neutral concepts like meritocracy and objectivity, which in practice, he said, tend to reinforce white supremacy. The fight against oppression of people of color was a major goal of early critical race theorists. In other words, they sought not just to change the status quo, but also to critique it. So imagine critical legal studies, but now instead of being focused generally on the entire superstructure and with a sort of a side view to how it affects the maintenance of the economic base, now there's a change in focus with the development of critical legal theory to the oppression that is experienced in particular by this one group. Now, up until the point that we get to critical legal theory, for the most part, all of these neo-Marxists, very much like Marx, have the focus of their attention in terms of the oppressed group as the proletariat, as the workers. But now what we see with the development of critical race theory is a refocus from the workers as the oppressed group about which we ought to be concerned to racial and ethnic minorities as the oppressed group about which we ought to be concerned. But still, the idea is that there is cultural hegemony on the part of the dominant group, which would be whites, manifested through social institutions of various kinds, including values as to what's right and wrong and good and valuable, that have the effect of keeping the oppressed racial groups, black people, brown people, whatever, down. There are some other offshoots of critical legal studies I'll mention just to sort of round out the discussion here. Alongside critical race theory, there developed something called critical feminist theory. And these folks are often called femcrits for short. And then, even more interestingly, what's called queer theory. And of course, the focus there is on yet another oppressed group, which would be those who are, instead of being straight, gay, or lesbian, or transgendered. But again, all of these parallel offshoots of critical legal studies still have in common this focus, if you will, on the superstructure, but now with an emphasis on how the superstructure tends to reinforce and maintain oppression of other kinds of oppressed groups than just the workers. Okay, so we've gotten a history now of critical legal theory. What I'd like to do next for you is to provide you with an overview of what you might call the key ideas or the key concepts of critical race theory. And for this purpose, I'm going to draw very heavily on the writings of Neil Shenvi, whom I referred to earlier. First of all, the key idea in critical race theory, and indeed in all of critical theory, is this division of society into oppressor and oppressed. According to the adherents of critical theory, including critical race theory, the identity of every individual is fundamentally based upon what kinds of social identity groups he's a part of. In particular, your identity as an individual depends upon whether you're in the relevant oppressor group or in the relevant oppressed group. So your identity is defined in terms of your race, of your class, of your gender, of your physical ability, of your age, just to name some of the axes of comparison that are important to critical theory. And so to the extent that one might try to say, well, I'm not like other people in my group, I have a different point of view, etc., critical theory and critical race theory would be very skeptical of that claim, because again, what is definitional for your very identity, for who you are, for your nature or your essence, is this group or these groups of which you're a part. Second key idea of critical theory and critical race theory, that oppression occurs primarily, not directly, but indirectly through, again, the hegemonic power, or what Gramsci called cultural hegemony. So the idea is that on any of these axes of comparison, whether it's race or sex or gender, what's going on is the dominant group is exercising power over the subordinate group by virtue of these social institutions, social structures, including, again, notions of what is good and right and valuable. So if you understand this premise, you can see why a critical theorist considers men or whites or heterosexuals or people who are rich to be oppressors. When they say that, when the critical race theorists or other critical theorists say something like that, you are a racist, or you are this, or you are that, they're not necessarily saying that the person to whom they're speaking is actively, subjectively desiring a racist or sexist output, that is, desiring to bring about harm or disadvantage for a member of the oppressed group. No, what they're saying is, as a member of the oppressor group, you cannot help but participate in the hegemonic domination that is taking place. It is just there as a part of the social structure. You can't help but benefit from it, and you can't help, by virtue of being a part of the society, of somehow participating in it and keeping it alive and boosting it. Third key idea, lived experience Listen to this. It's a quotation from a couple of critical theorists. The idea that objectivity is best reached only through rational thought is a specifically Western and masculine way of thinking, one that we will challenge throughout this book. Did you hear that? Logic, reason, the demand for evidence are alleged to be not universal values, but values of a particular oppressor group, namely white Europeans in this case. Okay, so what is proposed as an alternative way of gathering knowledge to logic, rationality, and testing and evidence? Well, the answer is personal testimony, lived experience as it's called. What does lived experience mean? Have you heard this expression, this is true for me, my truth? It is the truth that you discover by looking at your own reaction to, your own experience of reality, which may in fact be at odds with what one would perceive to be the reality if one still adheres to traditional norms of logic and rationality and evidence gathering. And according to this view, this lived experience outweighs the traditional kind of logic and rationality-based evidence, meaning that people from an oppressed group have unique insights in the reality that those who are a part of the oppressor group do not. And that this truth is something that is fundamentally unavailable to people who are in the oppressor groups. So, what does that mean for someone who's in the oppressor group? Well, it means he needs to listen to the lived experience of those in the oppressed group. And however much it may seem to him to be contrary to what he would think is really the case, given logic and rationality and evidence, he has to accept it as true. Members of the oppressed group, because of this lived experience way of gathering or getting to the truth, can't challenge the claims. There's another expression to describe this phenomenon. It's called standpoint epistemology. Epistemology is a fancy word for theory of knowledge, but the idea is that as you move from one standpoint to another, from that of oppressor to oppressed, along any axis of comparison, you come upon a fundamentally different way of knowing and of getting at reality that might not necessarily be available to or accessible by members of other groups. Next point, our key idea, the guise of objectivity. According to critical theory generally and critical race theory in particular, oppressor groups hide behind the guise of objectivity. This is related to the notion of cultural hegemony. According to this theory, what it is that those who are in the oppressor groups do is whenever they present their understanding of what is good and valuable and useful, their social norms, in defending the structures, the existing social structures, what they're doing is trying to say that these norms, these values, these structures are normal, that they're normative and they're objectively right, when in fact, according to this theory, there really is no such thing as objectively right when it comes to social values or social structures. Notice here in this key idea that there is lurking something that is very dangerous. We're going to talk about this in greater depth later on, and that is an extreme form of relativism. Extreme form of relativism with respect to the question of how we get at truth. And a final characteristic or key idea of critical race theory that I'd like to share with you is one that you may have heard of. It's a term that's being used very much these days in a variety of settings, and that is intersectionality. What's the idea here? The idea is that individuals at the intersection of different oppressed groups experience oppression in a unique way. Consider contrasting a white woman and a black woman. A white woman is a member of only one oppressed group, that is, women. But the black woman is a member of two oppressed groups, not only women, but also blacks. Critical theory generally, and critical race theory in particular, contend that those who find themselves at the intersection of more than one oppressed group experience oppression a little bit differently from those who fall into only one oppressed group or oppressed category, and so have a unique perception of oppression that would differ from those who do not experience their intersectionality. And this is important, practically speaking, for the critical theorist, because it means that once we get down to the business of trying to take action against the cultural hegemony, fight back against it, whenever we get into groups, we need to be very sensitive to listen to the stories, the lived experience of those who are experiencing intersectionality. For example, in women's groups that are designed to promote women's rights, it's understood or thought to be a terrible mistake to set up the organization with just the standpoint of oppressed white women. We need to take into account oppressed black women's unique viewpoint as well, lest we end up, in the course of trying to eliminate oppression, actually reinforcing it for those who are having this intersectional experience. That is my summary for you of what critical race theory, again, which is a part of critical theory, is. What we want to do next is to consider why or how it is so problematic.